order. A question usually begins with who, what, where, when, or how.
My name is Kevin Higgins. I'm actually from the city of Temecula, not from San Clemente, but still concerned. It's approximately, I think, 12.5 miles from here. Two questions, very quickly. Dr. Gunderson stated that it seems as though the only way to close this place down is through safety issues. Attacking the safety issues. Okay, he said that, I think, 3 times.
Speak in the mic.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Dr. Gunderson stated that the safety issues are the only way to get the facility closed down. He didn't state it exactly that way, but he basically stated that if it's too costly for them to make the repairs, then they would shut it down. I'm just curious to know how accurate that is. Is that the only way you can get this place shut down?
No. There's a famous Supreme Court case called PG&E versus the Energy Commission of California, in which the Supreme Court ruled that states have and localities have inherent powers that are not involved with the safety that can be exercised over nuclear plants. This had to do with a nuclear safeguard statute in California that bars the construction of new nuclear power plants until there's a solution to the waste problem. And that statute was upheld by the Supreme Court because it said the state has power over economic matters, land use matters, a whole series of other things, so long as they weren't directly on nuclear safety. So to be clear, the California Coastal Commission has some power as to whether this facility will get relicensed. The Public Utilities Commission has a lot of power as to whether or not they're going to continue to provide a ratepayer compensation for continued operations. There are directions that have been given by state legislation that both Edison and PG&E have to do new seismic studies as to the additional risk. The Energy Commission has some power, and of all places, the State Water Board has a good deal of power for one very interesting reason. This reactor and Diablo both dump huge amounts of very hot water into the ocean and are frying a lot of fish. And Water Board has ordered all power plants to convert from once-through cooling, where they dump the water back into the ocean, to cooling towers. Edison and PG&E were able to get an exemption from the schedule for that compared to others, and also the ability to do some study as to whether they could come up with an alternative. So the Water Board can simply say, no, we're going to require you to convert from once-through cooling and do it quickly. And that may end up shutting the reactors down. That is what Governor Cuomo is relying on in New York for his efforts to close out Indian Point.
Okay, and then the last question, and I'm making it quick, but if other countries are shutting down nuclear power plants, is it based just on the safety issues in regards to what they've learned, that it's not adequate, and there's other fuel, obviously, means of energy, and this is such a high risk that they're not willing to take it anymore?
Largely for the 4 countries I mentioned, it's primarily because of the safety. And at the same time, they recognize that the future of energy is going to be the renewables, so let's get on with it.
Okay, thank you so much.
My name is Ron Rudardi. Thank you for being here. I'm from Dana Point. I have a comment to make. You mentioned 93 million miles, and it made me instantly think of this. The logic behind nuclear power came from weapons industry. And what was done is they turned the whole idea on its head, and through really illogical planning, tried to bring the sun to Earth. And we have plenty of places we can receive the sun without that sort of atomic pile going on. It's kind of like the old joke, we're going to the sun, but we're doing it at night. We're going to land on the sun and do it at night. That's what those twin domes are, that particular logic. And there's really no real concern for the human aspect of what these weapons do, because they are weapons, they're contained weapons. And it seems to me that the logic behind them these days has been to keep the population in line, because everybody's worried about it. And it's just another focus for the whole country. Do you believe, and is it your concern as well, that this industry has run its course and is merely being used as a stopgap measure to take our minds off other issues? Could it be that kind of issue now?
Well, first of all, you're correct about the origins of civil nuclear power. President Eisenhower in the early 50s, because of the rising concern about the spread of nuclear weapons, gave a famous speech called the Atoms for Peace speech, in which he proposed beating nuclear swords into plowshares and using the power of the bomb to produce power, electricity. My primary concern about nuclear power has always been its connection with nuclear weapons, because many countries get their nuclear weapons through their civil nuclear program that proliferates the weapons. As to whether it's designed to keep us not thinking about nuclear, about other matters, I don't think that's it. I think there's just a huge economic interest. It's not a technology which is cost effective. It requires massive taxpayer subsidies, and the industry has been very effective in getting Congress to provide those. By the way, you all know the scandal about Solyndra and the loan guarantees that solar company received. What's never being mentioned is that the loan guarantee program for the nuclear power plants is massive. It's $18 billion of loan guarantees for new nuclear plants, and if any of them fail, we have to pay for that. And they're trying to increase that by another $36 billion. So if we lost $500 million in a solar plant, imagine what we can lose with a nuclear plant.
Hi, Dave. I'm Gene Stone from Residents Organized for a Safe Environment. And I'd like you to reiterate your point about the brittle stainless steel, because in the early days, those of us that were sent through some of these meetings at various different power plants across the nation, it was stated quite clearly and emphatically by the designers of these plants that it would be too dangerous to operate these plants past their 40-year period because of that issue alone, let alone several other issues. So this is a critical point about relicensing these plants for another 20, 30, 40 years, because they were never designed that way. And if you people want to look up something, go look up the record, the official record of those original meetings, and maybe you can speak to that. Thank you.
It's a very good point. There was an extraordinary series several months ago by the Associated Press that looked at these aging issues. And it looked particularly at the claims that are now being made that they can extend the life of these reactors 20, 30, 40 years beyond their design life. And the argument that was being made now by the industry that the design life was always an economic calculation, never a determination of safety. And AP went back and looked at the original record, and it was very clear that at that time the statement about the design life was purely based on the safety. What happens is when neutrons bombard material, they change it. They activate some of the elements within it, make them radioactive. It changes them from what they are to something else. And it makes the material more brittle. What's called the null ductility factor changes. So the risk of that cracking, if you have to pour in your emergency core cooling system, goes way up. And the only reason it's being done is because it's very difficult now to get licensed to build a new reactor. So if you can extend the life of your existing reactor, which already has a license, you bypass all those safety reviews. When a reactor gets relicensed, and this is very important, I think, to all of you, they don't go through and look at whether it's safe to today's standards. They are restricting the renewal consideration to a very narrow set of issues. And so I am deeply concerned about this idea of trying to squeeze out every last bit of electricity from a device that wasn't designed to run that long. I really think that the risks increase exponentially if you run beyond the design life, and they increase as you approach the design life.
Next, please.
Randall Siege from San Clemente. And I'm referring, my question is coming from Associated Press study. It took a year, it recently came out. Are you familiar with that study?
Well, just mentioned, yeah.
Okay, so that study you would recommend people here to go to for information?
I found it very credible, and it fits very much with what I know from years of study.
Which study? I'm sorry.
The Associated Press did a series, I believe, of 4 or 5 investigative pieces on the American nuclear industry. It came out 2 or 3 months ago, and it had been a year-long investigative piece of research that led to the articles.
So this was started well before Fukushima ever began, because that was only 7 months ago. So, but there's one particular thing that really concerned me. Looking at this as safety rules loosened for aging nuclear reactors, and maybe you can talk to this, but they used 11,000 pages of information that they requested from the NRC to write the report. So this is coming from the NRC. Of course, they make their interpretations, but it says federal regulators have been working closely with the nuclear power industry to keep nations' aging reactors operating within safety standards by repeatedly weakening those standards or simply failing to enforce them. Is that in line with actually changing the standards, in other words, so that they would actually, so they could continue to operate them?
Yes. What AP found is that every time it was discovered that reactors were having difficulty meeting safety regulations of the NRC, particularly those due to aging, rather than enforcing the rules, the NRC would then relax the regulation. And this has been my experience over and over and over again. The problems are not entirely that the regulations are weak. The problems are that they don't enforce them. And then when they've come across a regulation that's been violated, rather than enforcing it, they just weaken it again. Let me give you one example from the EPA, though, which is similar. For this disposal of high-level radioactive waste, EPA and NRC were supposed to come up with rules as to how to determine whether or not a repository was going to be safe. And they knew that the peak time of public exposure was going to occur 100,000 or several 100,000 years into the future. So they created rules that said you only had to comply with the radiation standards for the first 10,000 years. It's like that old joke about jumping off the top of the Empire State Building and passing the 80th floor and saying, so far, so good. Well, the first 10,000 years, so far, so good. But you're going to fry later. And that was struck down by the court. They had to go back. So what they did is they created a standard for the first 10,000 years and a standard 30 times higher for the next period of time. This happens over and over and over again. And let me tell you once again, if we had a regulator that enforced the rules, turned down the poorest of the applications, gave big fines to companies, got the industry to obey its rules, my views would be somewhat different about nuclear power. My problem is that the regulators are not completely, but the top regulators in the direction they give to everyone below them are absolutely insufficient to be able to assure the safety that we need. One other tiny example for a moment, which I believe that the AP story mentioned as well. When you run a reactor, you have boric acid that you use to control corrosion and to control, that's mainly for absorbing neutrons in the water. And the problem is when the control rods come in and out, they take some of that boric acid with it, and that boric acid tends to collect atop the reactor vessel. So NRC had rules. You're supposed to go up on top of the reactor vessel every few months or something and check to see if the acid's doing any damage. And at a reactor in Ohio called Davis-Besse, they didn't do it. A year went by, a couple of years went by. NRC ordered them to do the inspection. They said, no, we'd like to delay it until our next fueling. By the time they went up to the top of the reactor and checked this out, they discovered that the acid had eaten through 6 inches of carbon steel, leaving behind 3/16 of an inch of inner stainless steel liner that was bulging from the pressure. And if they hadn't checked it, if it had gone another few weeks or months, they would have eaten through that and blown the reactor vessel. You would have had the potential for a full melt. And it's just a sleep at the switch regulator and industry that isn't following the rules. So the AP story is incredibly important because it shows that the reactors are having aging problems. But rather than deal with it, the NRC deals with it by simply relaxing the requirements.
With the engineers that said that have since retired, and some of the actually nuclear regulatory commissioners.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. But
Okay.
just so you can get started on it.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Do you want these returned?
No.
Okay, we'll have copies.
Roger Johnson, San Clemente. 2 related questions on radioactive fallout. We heard 2 speakers here tonight mention that San Onofre regularly releases radioactive steam. Could you tell us what that's all about, number one? And number two, you talked about evacuation, and you were worried that the roads were too crowded. It couldn't possibly happen. What about if we do what they want us to do? We all assemble at the Orange County Fairgrounds, take a shower, and we're all safe. Plus, 28 miles away, is there any point in evacuating anywhere? How far would you go, and what's the point?
Give me the first one so I can come back to the
San Onofre releases radioactive steam regularly without announcement.
I don't believe what they were quite saying was steam, but it's also partially true. What Dr. Caldicott was referring to are some noble gases, radioactive xenon, radioactive krypton, and radioactive argon, that are very hard to avoid releasing. They just, when you're running a reactor, it gets out. And then you're permitted to let all sorts of other stuff out. So tritium, cesium, strontium at certain levels. If you go to Title 10 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 20, Appendix B, there's a table of how much of each radionuclide NRC lets San Onofre release each year without getting a violation. If they go over it, then it's a violation. They still do it. But those numbers are very high. EPA has criticized them as not being protective of public health. But NRC basically says it's hard to run a reactor without radioactive releases, so go ahead and release this much each year.
How often do they do that? How much?
Well, some of this is going on just every single day. Tritium is very hard to control. It's HTO, so it goes off as radioactive steam or radioactive water. Some of it shouldn't be happening. It's leaking from underground pipes. You've seen this from around the country. Reactors now have tritium plumes at many of the reactors, and that's not permissible. That's going even beyond what the NRC says you can do. The xenon and the krypton and the argon are just, they're noble gases, so you can't seize them and keep them bottled up very easily. So essentially, these are leaky devices. I have to say, though, that that risk is pretty small compared to the risk of the accident. I don't know that the risks to you living here from the normal releases would exceed the risk to someone living near the El Segundo oil refinery or some other place. There's nothing that's pure in our environment. So they're adding radioactivity. It will have some effect. Is it a large effect or a small effect, and how does it compare to other risks? It's not a trivial matter, but it is, to me, not the top of the list of the concerns.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
Oh, evacuation you asked me about for a second. I have no good answer how you evacuate, or whether you go to the fairgrounds, or whether...
Are you safe at the fairgrounds?
No, I mean, unless the wind is blowing away from the fairgrounds, I know. But let me make one other quick point about evacuation. At the Diablo Canyon evacuation proceedings, which I also sat through, the interveners pointed out that in an earthquake, the freeway was likely to be damaged. And the pathway that we're going to use to evacuate, the overpasses would crumble. You couldn't get out anyway. And the NRC licensing board, which was required to reject the license if there wasn't a workable evacuation plan, but was basically ordered to give them the license, came up with the most extraordinary decision I've ever read in my life. And Orwell would have loved it. The NRC ruled that it was, quote unquote, non-credible, their famous phrase, that there would ever be an earthquake simultaneously with a reactor accident. Well, no one was ever talking about them being two separate events. The earthquake would cause the reactor accident and bring down your freeway overpasses, and you couldn't get out. So they gave them the license, and that's now become a generic rule, that you can't consider the effects of the earthquake on the evacuation plan. That's silly.
Thanks for coming, esteemed speaker. Besides this, the next woman who would ask the earlier question about Santa Susana, besides that you might get to, at the last hearing here, nuclear engineer Ernest Goyton expressed concern about aging cement not being as elastic as it used to be when first laid at nuclear power facilities. And then could you also discuss the safety implications of steam generator replacement at San Onofre reactors?
Probably not. Ernie Goytine, who you mentioned, would be more able to talk about the steam generator problem than I. I don't know what the problem is about the cement itself aging. Steam generators are where we transfer the heat, and they often develop pinpoint leaks that end up having to get repaired. There was quite a bit of trouble repairing them here. but I don't know much more detail about it. You asked about Santa Susana, so let me just end with that for a moment. I got involved in this arena by accident, if you'll pardon the expression. There was a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, and my students at UCLA said, can we investigate whether there are any nuclear facilities in Southern California, whether they've had any problems? And I said, sure. And I figured they couldn't find anything. I mean, TMI was some unique event. And within a few weeks, my students had discovered that there had been a partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor, which had no containment structure, not like San Rafael, which has a concrete dome, much smaller, but in the Los Angeles area, in the hills above Simi Valley and the West San Fernando Valley. It was called the sodium reactor experiment. A compound called tetralum had leaked into the sodium coolant and globbed up the coolant channels like chewing gum would. So the fuel overheated, it melted, a third of the core experienced melting. And they were intentionally venting the radioactive gases into the environment for weeks because there was no containment, there was no place to control it. So they pumped it into the environment. And then they lied about it. They kept it secret for 2 decades till students uncovered the records. And I made one fatal mistake. And so I promised that community I would help them try to get the facility closed down and cleaned up. And 32 years later, I'm still stuck with that. And as you heard, the Boeing company has filed suit against the state of California to overturn a law requiring full cleanup. And Boeing is a very, very powerful entity. And half a century after that accident, we still may end up with no cleanup.
Aquifer?
There's contamination also in the groundwater. Yeah.
And awards? Millions of dollars of awards in the book?
There have been a number of lawsuits against Boeing that have resulted in settlements.
Councilmember Jim Everett has a question for you.
First of all, thank you very much for kind of bringing us back into more of a middle ground in terms of hysteria versus, reality. Okay, and I tend to agree that no one can say that it won't happen, but we also can't say that it will. And so I think that was a very good analysis. The one area, though, that I would like to question you on was you talked mainly because I took a tour of the plant and I saw what their security is like today. Now, I don't know when the last time you were down there, but you made a comment, you were talking about security and terrorists. It was kind of an implication that there was a very real possibility down there. You talked about only 5 terrorists. And I saw just the opposite when I went through the security process down there. I mean, the security was just outrageous.
Well, I hope so. There was an OSRI test that they did very poorly on some years ago. This is that black hat test that I was referring to. They do not have protection against attack from the air. Only one reactor in the country has a containment structure that was designed for a direct hit from a jumbo jet, and that's not San Onofre. And the design basis remains what I said it is. Now, they may be going beyond the design basis requirements, but I know enough about what damage you could do to a reactor, and if they had a large enough group and assistance from some insiders, I'm still very worried that they could do damage. Is it open, wide open? No. Is it capable of withstanding a very thoughtful attack? I don't think so. And what we saw on 9/11 was pretty remarkable. They had teams of people that trained for months to learn how to fly jumbo jets. I mentioned to you the probabilistic risk assessments, which show which sequence of events will lead to the greatest risk if it occurs accidentally. Those have been published for a long time, and a terrorist could use those to know precisely what to hit and in what order. So I don't want to seem to say that this is wide open. But I also think that a sophisticated attack has a non-negligible chance of disrupting the power, disrupting the cooling. And that's what really worries me.
Okay, thank you.
And Councilmember Brown.
I have to tell you, I also have to commend you on your presentation. I thought it was very fact-based, and I appreciate that. I like to operate more in the realm of reality. I do have a question, though. That I've heard the 130,000 prompt fatalities from radioactive. Is that from the Rasmussen report?
No. This is from a draft environmental impact statement prepared by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for San Onofre. I didn't understand what Helen was referring to from Rasmussen. Rasmussen had said that the tiny chance of any casualties from any kind of an accident.
That was my understanding.
It was thrown out.
And it
Congress,
was 1 in 6 billion
the
chance.
chance of anyone dying from a nuclear accident was greater than the chance of being hit twice by lightning, was the famous statement by Rasmussen. And then the NRC had to withdraw its approval of the Rasmussen report, particularly the executive summary. The American Physical Society set up a special panel. Congress set up a special panel, and it's been basically thrown out. So I think what Helen was referring to is some kind of Union of Concerned Scientists reanalysis.
Okay.
But the 130,000 is from the 1982 supplemental draft environmental impact statement by NRC, and I should make clear they were embarrassed by the number afterwards.
It was not a good report. It's not a reliable.
No, I'm not talking about Rasmussen. I'm talking about the 82 environmental impact statement.
Okay.
NRC didn't like the fact that they had published something with such a large number in it.
What?
But let me be clear, it's credible. If you let that much radioactivity out in the few miles around a plant and you don't evacuate people, you can get those kind of acute fatalities.
Okay. One other question, and the only reason I'm asking it now is because it has been answered today. One of the questions we asked in one of the last council meetings was we were asking about the qualifications of each of the speakers who are showing up, and it wasn't clear based on your biography, scientific credentials, qualifications. Could you just speak to that really quickly?
Sure, briefly. I've been teaching at the University of California since 1975, initially at UCLA, and then in 1981 or 2, moved up to UC Santa Cruz, where I founded the Adlai Stevenson Program on Nuclear Policy, which was an interdisciplinary research and teaching program at UC Santa Cruz. You may remember that the university runs the weapons labs at Los Alamos and Livermore. This was controversial, and so the university system-wide decided to set up programs at each campus to deal with the nuclear threat using some of the money that they got from running the labs. Did that through the 80s. 89 became an energy and environment fellow at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington, and then returned up to UC Santa Cruz in the late 1990s and have been there since teaching nuclear policy. My specialty, though, is the interaction between the technical and the policy side. And as I'm sure you've come across in your own work, the physicists often don't know how to talk about anything in a language that a policymaker needs to understand, and the political scientists don't know what a neutron is. So my job is to, if you'll pardon the expression, bridge that gap. Sorry. You're not faster than I.
I have one question
Sure.
for you also. Back in March when the Fukushima Daiichi tragedy happened, we sat with city staff and asked them to take a look at Indian Point for best practices, recognizing that that was more similar than one of the 104 in the country. And that wasn't really a productive exercise. But the thought was that's a densely populated area. Are there things that reactors in densely populated areas should do? And this wouldn't be instead of something else. It would be in the category of covering the frontier. Can you talk about that? And also, I did not know Cuomo was trying
Yes.
to...
When Cuomo was Attorney General, he was a strong opponent of continued operation of Indian Point. Now that he's governor, he has, New York Times reported a couple months ago that he sent senior aides to the operators of Indian Point to let them know he was committed to shutting them down. And he's doing that through the use of the state water law. Like San Onofre, Indian Point needs certain state permits. And he's made it clear that he isn't going to give them those state permits, and they need to start thinking about the transition. And I think the reason for that is exactly at the base of the question you asked. It's very hard. Just imagine, anyone who knows Manhattan. The plume's traveling, it's going to get to you in 6 hours. How do you get people out of New York? The reason you didn't find best practices is they can't find an answer to that question. They can't find a way to evacuate people quickly enough. The plume gets to them faster than you can move them. And I believe, look, a reasonable position, and it's not necessarily the position I would take, but a reasonable position is that we reduce the nuclear risk by reducing the risks from the most hazardous of the reactors. And Indian Point,
Thank you. thank you very much for making time for us, and that was a really, really instructive presentation. Thank you.